Hello, I'm Richard Murphy, and I'm going to talk about an aspect of modern monetary theory that seems to cause quite a lot of confusion. I've been asked whether modern monetary theory applies in developing countries. And the answer is, well, yes, of course it does, because modern monetary theory explains how an economy and its relationship with the money that it creates and the tax system that it has all work. So modern monetary theory isn't a policy, it isn't a choice, it's a description of a reality. And there is a reality about modern monetary theory in developing countries. But, and there is a big but, and therefore the question that's been asked is relevant, it is that there are aspects of what one would desire in those economies that do not exist, which, however, modern monetary theory makes clear, and that's the merit of it. What MMT, modern monetary theory, says is that if a country has its own central bank and its own currency, and it only borrows in that currency, then it can, at least in theory, never become insolvent. It could in practice because it could choose to, but I'm going to presume that governments don't choose to go insolvent by choice. So basically in that situation the government cannot become insolvent because and I've recently posted a comment that proves this from the ECB, the European Central Bank, a government in that situation can always simply create more money to settle its liabilities. But, and this is the but with regard to developing countries, two things apply. One is that they don't always use their own currencies in their own economies. In fact, there's a very dangerous situation with regard to macroeconomic control of many of these countries' economies in that they let a second currency circulate, which is often preferred to the local one, and that second currency is most commonly the US dollar. And secondly, they borrow in that other currency, again, usually the US dollar, a situation which is not helped by the World Bank, the IMF and other international organisations frequently making loans in dollars, and then insisting that the country has to repay in US dollars, which does necessarily mean it's got to generate those dollars by export sales to service the loans, which are often used for domestic purposes, creating an enormous imbalance and stress within the economy, which means it can never meet the demand for loan repayment out of the activity that is generated by the loan funds, creating eventually an economic crisis, which we are too familiar with. But what MMT does is point out that these imbalances exist. It says you should not make loans, if you are the IMF or the World Bank, to a developing country in US dollars if the loan is to be for the purposes of local economic development. In fact, it says you shouldn't simply make loans to that country in any other currency than that which it wishes to use for itself. And the IMF and the World Bank should assume the exchange risk as a consequence. It also says that a country should not tolerate the circulation of a second currency as a common form of settlement within it. And it can do that by having a strong and effective tax system that demands that its own currency is in use for the purposes of settlement of tax. Now, unfortunately, let's be clear, and we know this, the tax systems of very many developing countries are quite simply too weak for that enforcement to take place. It isn't uncommon for half of tax revenues in developing countries to simply not be collected because of the weakness of enforcement in those tax systems. And with that comes an effective failure of macroeconomic control on behalf of the government. So what we're seeing is MMT saying something very clearly, which is not about a policy prescription, but about an economic management system that should be put in place to ensure that the conditions in which a government can put in place its own economic policy decisions must arise. So MMT says that a country should not borrow in a foreign currency. And it is time, as I say, for the international financial institutions to recognise that. It says that there should be strong local effective taxation and enforcement, and it is time for the international financial institutions and others to support that. I would include in that list of others those large multinational companies who are all too good at extracting profit without paying tax in these locations. And the government in question should be accountable for the budgets that it sets, for the management of its economy, the measurement of its tax revenues, the control of its tax gap, the reporting on that issue to its parliament, and the way in which it holds itself open to accountability to a parliament at some point in the course of the process of the management of that economy. Without those things, MMT makes it clear that effective economic management cannot take place. So that's what MMT says about these places. That's why it remains important. And that's why MMT doesn't mean that we can choose how to operate. MMT describes what the preconditions of that choice of operation within the economy are. I hope that helps explain, but it doesn't mean that MMT is not relevant to developing countries. In fact, it means it's very relevant to developing countries because it sets out a pathway for the economic liberation of these places so they can take control of their economic affairs, which is something which I've been campaigning for over 30 years. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in what I've been saying in this video, please subscribe. There is a button below the viewing screen. If you're interested in what I have to say on Twitter, I'm at Richard J. Murphy on that medium. If you want to look at my blog, that's taxresearch.org.uk. And we have a Facebook page as well, Richard J. Murphy. So one of those things will get you more information on what this video series is about, and I hope I'll see you again soon.